Now, one of the things that makes relationships so difficult is the way in which we protect ourselves from suffering, from our own and from each other's. Because when you love somebody, you don't want to lay your suffering on them and your fears. And also you're afraid that if you open your heart too far, their suffering will overwhelm you. Because when you look at the world, you just see suffering everywhere. If you scratch the surface of every person in this room, you will find that there is some suffering. And some people who are walking around here smiling at each other and sitting down and having wonderful, gentle conversations, inside have very, very deep pain and deep fear. But they have learned so well how to mask it from each other. And the culture reinforces that, saying, don't bring your pain to me. I only want your happiness. I'll put up with a little bit of it, but not much of it, because you'll scare me. Now, just as I said before, that if you are going to be able to see somebody else's beauty, you have to be able to acknowledge your own beauty. In a similar way, if you are going to be able to be available for someone else's suffering, you have to be able to acknowledge your own suffering and be able to understand the nature of suffering in such a way that you have converted the quality of suffering in yourself. Gurdjieff, the Russian philosopher, said there is nothing that can be attained spiritually without suffering in life. But at the same time, if you are going to proceed on the journey, you must sacrifice suffering. You hear that dual nature of it. You have to have suffered, because the suffering is what burns through you and deepens the compassion and opens the door. Suffering brings you closer to the mystery. And at the same moment, if you hold on to the suffering and grab at it and sort of wallow in it or cling to it, it stops the journey. There is an understanding of suffering such that you don't invite suffering into your life, but when it comes, you work with it and transform it. I mean, the extreme of it is the Christian monk who's saying, God, God, give me more pain. Give me more suffering, because I want to get closer to you. And Maharaji is saying, do you like suffering or joy? And saying, I love suffering, it brings me so close to God. To understand the nature of suffering is the precondition for being able to convert it, to see the way in which suffering is grace. That suffering is a gift that's given to you to allow you to come home. Because the understanding is contained in the Buddha's first three Noble Truths. First one is there is suffering. Birth has suffering, death has suffering, sickness has suffering, aging has suffering, not getting what you want has suffering, getting what you don't want has suffering. Even getting what you want has suffering because it's in time and it's going to corrupt. So there's fear even in having what you want. So there's suffering inherent in being in form, is the base rule. It's just built into it. It's not that Buddha was a downer. He was just pointing out, because people are so busy denying it, he was pointing out that that's an inherent nature of form. There is suffering. But then his second noble truth is the crux of the matter. He said the cause of suffering in all of this is the clinging of mind. It's like you watch people age. I can feel as I age that the suffering would come if I held on to my youth. But to the extent that I open to these new sensations and new... See, like if I could run the 4-minute mile in 10 minutes, and then as I get older, I can only run the 4-minute mile in 20 minutes. If I'm living in a culture which only measures my adequacy in terms of how fast I run the 4-minute mile, do you realize that age is my enemy? You realize that what I'm doing is making nature my enemy. I'm making the nature of things my enemy. Do you see the inherent problem in living in a culture which worships youth, which worships all of the qualities of power? It's a hunting and gathering. It's a hunting tribe. Hunting tribe. And so the peak years are, I don't know, 18, 20 to 40, something like that. And then from then on, it's all downhill. And medical science allows us now to go on and on and on and on. So it's just slowly going down and down and down. If down is measured by these very narrow values, and if you look at the advertising in our culture, except for IRAs and insurance, the numbers of images of older people are very, very few. They're treated as a minority group and given a certain fraction just to keep the Retired People's Association from getting up in arms politically. But now you can look at the essence of what the issue is. The issue is not the growing old. The issue is the clinging to a model of anything. Like you cling to a model of what beauty is. The fun I have is playing with that issue in the culture. Because as I always say in my lectures, I look at this hand, and you look at this hand now, and it's all getting wrinkled, and there's these blood veins and bones showing. There used to be all this skin. You never noticed that stuff, and now it's all wrinkly, and it's got spots on it. It's really incredible. I mean, just as an aesthetic experience, you know, if I didn't think it was my hand, just looking at that, it's really quite beautiful. I mean, it's got real character. And I love these spots, you know, they're really far out, these spots like these, you know. And I love that in the culture, the Porcelana ad, it says, they call these aging spots, I call them ugly, says a woman as she's putting on Porcelana cream, see? And it's interesting that as you flip your consciousness and just start to allow the processes of nature to happen and stop pitting yourself against them, you're able to say, they call these ugly. I call them aging spots. And there's just a kind of a relaxed appreciation of change instead of this feeling like it's all downhill and, oh, I used to be able to walk and now I can't walk, I've got to sit. It's interesting about aging. I mean, what have you been doing all week? You sit, you draw your awareness in from your ears and from your eyes, you follow your breath. Look what happens when you get old. You lose your hearing, you lose your sight, you got arthritis, you can't move. It's an absolutely perfect time for meditating. It's as if God was giving you a little message saying, don't you think it's time you looked inside? And you're saying, no, we're all young, and you're busy being young. Well, now, it's wonderful to stay vital and stay active and stay all that, and to take care of your body and treat it with respect and enjoy it. If you look at the myths of old age in this culture, it is showing all old people acting like young people and saying, isn't that wonderful? Well, it's wonderful and it stinks both. Because it is creating myths that create suffering. And myths that create suffering are evil. Because they increase paranoia and separateness. And I think there are really interesting, there's such unconsciousness in the way our culture works. And when you begin to be a little conscious, you can hardly bear what you're seeing, that it's all different than you thought it was. Now, so that the second noble truth is the clinging to the suffering. The clinging of mind is what creates the suffering. You watch it in dying. If people are holding to life, they're suffering about dying. If people are wishing they were dead, if they have a model they wish they were dead, they're suffering in living. If they wish they were rich, they're suffering because they're poor. And I have been with people now in other cultures where, you know, it absolutely disoriented me for many, many times in India when I saw people who had so little that they were so far below our poverty line in this culture. And when I looked into their eyes, I saw a quality of peace and a quality of joy that I didn't see in the upper middle class in America. And it knocked into a hat the whole model I had, that somehow there was an equation between economics and and happiness. Now, that doesn't mean you deny that reality. There is a relative reality about it, and for many people that's true. That's why you got to recognize that different people suffer in different ways, and for you to interpret someone else's suffering on the basis of whether you would suffer in that condition is a fallacy. That you cannot assume that somebody else is suffering just because you would suffer in that circumstance. Or the opposite. Yes. And so that's where it becomes interesting that when you have learned to convert your own suffering, it is still not fair or appropriate to assume that someone else either wants to or can convert their suffering. And their suffering is very real for them. And you have to listen in each case to hear what the nature of the suffering is and how you alleviate it. As long as you're identified with your suffering, all you're hearing is your empathy about another person's suffering and your pity and your reactivity to their suffering, not your responsiveness to their suffering. And the game is to be responsive rather than reactive to suffering. So that once you begin to awaken, you start to look at your own life as how will it help me grow, and then you see that the reason you are suffering is because of the way your mind is clinging. And so that suffering starts to be a clue to you of the way your mind is clinging, and otherwise you wouldn't notice that clinging. And since you would like to work with letting go of the clingings of mind, you begin to treasure the suffering because it shows you. You treasure the anger because it shows you that a model you had was just disconfirmed. And when you get angry, when you get frustrated, in all the ways you suffer, those are all clues to you that your secret stash of clinging of mind was just uncovered. And you look and you say, caught me again. And in a way, you get in, like for me, it's a dialogue with Maharaji, where every time I'm caught in suffering, I see he's just chiding me, saying, oh, you think you're so free? Try this one on. Try this. And it's interesting, especially when you start to deal with people who have dramatic life shifts, where they get a diagnosis or something like that that changes the whole meaning of their life. The question of how much they'll suffer is how quickly they can let go of who they used to be and be who they are now. To the extent that Kelly holds on to a model of himself as having the same body as you have, he is going to suffer. to the extent that he opens and says, this is what I'm working with, this is it, it's no better or worse, it's what I've got, then he doesn't suffer. That's a hard one, because it looks, your projection into him is that he must suffer because of that body, because you would suffer because of your attachment to your flexibility and freedom and so on. But can you imagine, I mean, from a bird's point of view, we must all be suffering terribly. I mean, look at those poor things, my God. And that's true. A human body is suffering. Just going into one is a real drag. I mean, you may feel really light and all, but wait, it'll decay. And even when it's feeling light, it's so limited, you can't do a lot of things with it. It's really a kind of a ponderous process, you know. Now, dealing with suffering is not, you know, it's hard work. It's hard work. I'm not trying to make it all light and ha 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 and isn't this all fun. This is damned hard work. And just these two quotes. One of these from Aeschylus. It says, pain falls drop by drop upon the heart until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. The awful grace of God. In other words, that part of us which is separate is screaming about the suffering. The part of us that's awakening is working to extract the wisdom from it. And it is a profoundly intense experience. And it is an experience in which suffering brings people closest to the possibility of awakening. That is what is so addictive to me about working with people that have diseases, that have all kinds of things, like I'm working with AIDS people more and more, that are people that are dying as they're approaching death, because those are the moments when their models are collapsing, when they are most ripe for a spiritual awakening. That's the most exciting time. When everybody's got it going just right, they are fast asleep into their models for the most part. It's interesting because it really flips the game around, and you begin to see in the way in which suffering awakens. And then when you want to be an instrument for helping people awaken and want to awaken yourself through being with other awakening people, you gravitate towards people that are suffering. Not because you're a sadist or because of anything, not from a psychological thing, from a spiritual point of view, because it's where the most living force is in human relations. And yet everybody, out of their fear, is making believe it's not happening. We're working on it. We're working on it step by step, bit by bit. Now, this is a very powerful letter from Lama Yeshe, who died recently, who was a very fine Tibetan Lama. And he became very ill. And this shows, here was somebody who had deep spiritual practices, and he had a hard time. And I want you to hear it, because I want you to hear that it isn't easy. But follow the letter through to its course. Some of the language is a little alien to you, because he's speaking to a fellow Lama. He's written a letter to a fellow Lama. Due to my right and left I got this from Jack Kornfield, by the way. Due to my right and left channels being filled with the violent movement of thought winds and overflowing out of control beyond the capacity of my ordinary heart to cope with it, and in order to safeguard myself, I was forced to place this difficult-to-find body of leisure and endowments in the hands of a strange doctor. Upon examining for half an hour, he advised that I must definitely go into the intensive care unit of the hospital. Believing that this was the case, I asked him to protect my life. Never have I known the experiences and sufferings which then followed. First, unending injections throughout the day and night. Second, because the capacity of my heart to pump oxygen was impaired, and in order to breathe, I used an oxygen tank from which a tube ran through my nose. This was never disconnected, the only way I could breathe, and caused great discomfort day and night. Third, I had to constantly take other medicines, sometimes more than 10 pills at a time, many times a day. Due to this medication, my body was powerlessly overcome by pain every 2 hours, and my memory degenerated. I had no appetite for more than a month, and whatever food I did eat, I threw up and suffered further. Some days, I could not do even the slightest bit of my prayers. My cousin came to see me, and I asked him to recite the mandala of the regeneration of the body, and listened with great effort. But often in my mind's confusion, my speech would become garbled. I would laugh at myself and then weep and be sad. I experienced and understood the confused mind in the deepest way, even in regards to the merest effort to say a sentence. It is extremely difficult to maintain understanding and balance without becoming confused during the stages of death, when the inner elements are being absorbed. It was at this time that I felt the power of my mind really degenerating. When I tried to think about different things and ideas, my mind became confused. It had been 41 days since I became ill. The condition of my body was such that I had become the lord of a cemetery. My mind was like that of an anti-god, and my speech like the barkings of an old mad dog. Now I still take 16 pills a day, and because I must depend on others for moving about and sleeping, and because my hand still shakes when I write, please, my dear Dharma brother, read this letter depending on the meanings intended and not upon the mere words spoken. These experiences I am relating to you, my pledged spiritual brother. Keep them from hard-headed logicians. In other words, don't let people who wouldn't understand it hear this. After my ability to recite prayers of ordinary words degenerated, and after these great sufferings, I considered what to do. Finally, I began stabilizing meditation with strong mindfulness and introspection. I am grateful for the years of training I had. By the power of this, there began to arise some clarity of mind. Within this state, I continued stabilizing meditation with great effort, and this was of much benefit, though the enemies of lethargy and confusion often overcame my meditation. I was reminded of the time we received the teachings together, my brother, from our Guru, and all of the kindnesses that have been bestowed upon me in this lifetime. During this time, though I received hundreds of letters, I was not allowed to read them, but thinking of you, the strength of my mind increased and my problems have lessened. So I end with a poem that I've written for you. Practice and meditate, training the heart, the sole remedy for coming to terms with our sufferings. The main object of cultivation of awe-inspiring yogis, the path followed by great saints of all ages. You need a happy mind, a conscientious mind, and an open heart. Especially you must learn to cultivate the precepts of transforming bad circumstances, the experiences of your suffering, and you into the very understand what I've said before, which was that why in the East all of life is seen as preparation for the moment of death. Because at the moment of death, when you experience the earth element leaving and you feel a heaviness, when you experience the water element leaving and you feel dryness, when you experience the fire element leaving and you experience coldness, when you experience the air element leaving and you experience your out-breath longer than your in-breath, when all of these are happening, they are so profound. Unless your mindfulness is strong, you will get lost into being thirsty or being cold. And that is the way you will die at that moment. And that is what propels you onward. And the art of dying in the present moment without the clinging of mind is exactly what the optimum game is when you understand reincarnation. But to do that, you have to have been able to transform the sufferings along the way and keep working with the more intense ones and more intense ones and more intense ones. And it's interesting that, like when Maharaji took 1,200 micrograms of LSD and nothing happened, the reason nothing happens is because his awareness, there's nothing for it to grab onto. There's no hooks, there's nothing clinging. And so the sufferings only happen to somebody. If you're somebody, you suffer. If you're not attached to your somebodyness, you don't suffer. It's just change, and change is flow, and you're flowing with the flow. You're not busy being somebody. The minute you try to stand somewhere, you're on tiptoe, you will suffer. Now, in this quality of suffering and the clinging of mind, and the third noble truth, of course, is you let go of the clingings of mind and you end the suffering until you're just this awareness and these phenomena occur. It's just like pain is just strong stimulus until you label it as pain. And your awareness gets so quiet. And at that point, you're really starting to be able to transform your own sufferings. And at that moment, you look back at your history and you see the way in which the sufferings that have occurred in your life have been part of what allowed you to be here today. That the way they burned into you and the way they deepened you and the way they made you ready so you didn't end up so superficial. And it's extraordinary. It's bizarre. You almost feel like you're perverse when you look at people that aren't suffering in a life and you begin to feel compassion. It's really strange because they're staying at such a superficial level of life. And you don't wish suffering on anybody. And you're dealing with this paradox, this continuous paradox, that suffering in yourself you don't want, but when you get it, you work with it and you see its grace even though you don't want it. And you grow with it. That you can handle. That one, that's paradoxical, but you barely can handle it. But suffering of somebody you love or suffering of other human beings is a whole other ballgame. And you may intellectually know that suffering is grace, but when your child is sick, or when your partner is sick, or when, somebody else is suffering, it is extremely hard to say, well, it's all grace. And your human heart wants to do everything you can to take away their suffering. And when you listen quietly inside, you listen to that paradox. And you live with that tension. You live with the fact that you doing something? You live with that paradox of the human heart. That the human heart is empathizing with suffering and is empathizing with suffering of a separate entity. Because the human emotional heart's part of your separateness. And when somebody else is suffering, it rips your human heart to shreds. That's what you were referring to yesterday. And you want to do everything you can to relieve the suffering, and there's so much of it that you end up, it's unbearable. And what you do is you armor your heart. You've got to protect your heart from the suffering. If to the extent that you identify only with your separateness, you have to protect yourself. You're protecting yourself in no questions this moment. I want to finish this sequence. You protect yourself in two ways at once. One is you're protecting yourself from the pain of others because you can't do it something. You can't take away their suffering, and it hurts you so much to see them suffering. And the other thing is you're protecting your separateness from the innate generosity of your heart, which would give away everything. Because the heart doesn't know boundaries. The deepest heart isn't an instrument of separateness. The deepest part of your heart is an instrument of unity. The deepest part of your heart, your conscious heart, your compassionate heart, your intuitive, deep heart, it knows that we are all one. It lives in that universe. It is our minds that puts up the separateness. Our minds are the instruments of our separateness. Our hearts are the doorways to our unity. So that the heart, unprotected, will just keep you suffering. It's not your suffering, it's our suffering. And here, take it. Take my house, take my car, take my life, take it all. What difference does it make? Because it's our suffering. How can I go on when you're suffering? Because there's no you and there's no me. And the mind is saying, now, wait a minute. Think about tomorrow. After all, you've got your separateness to consider. And so what we really have is a dialogue going on between the mind, which is an instrument, our thinking mind, which is an instrument of our separateness, and our compassionate heart, which is an instrument of our unity. So it's the dialogue between separateness and unity that's being fought out inside ourselves between the mind and the heart. And the mind throws a fish out now and then by what's called professional warmth, of pity and kindness and doing good, but doing good from a safe place. Doing good so that you don't threaten the integrity of the separate entity. But you see that as you identify more and more with that in you which is part of everything, the need to protect that separateness gets less and less, and you can let yourself more into the stream. You can start to swim. You can go in a little deeper. You can, because you learn how to swim a little. You don't have to just wade at the edge. You can start to go into the water of the universe of suffering more. I mean, I don't know whether I'm doing it with defense or truth. I really don't know yet, because I just got to keep listening and watching my body and my emotions and all that. But in fact, in the past week, or any week you take in my life, I am dealing with the most traumatic experiences that human beings can face. And people are calling me with crises, and they're just presenting them because I invite them. And what I find is that what I offer them is, first, my heart is breaking for their pain. And I would take it if I could, but I can't. But what I am is somebody that at the same moment as my heart hurts, I have a very, very deep appreciation of the lawful nature of things, and that is at some other level, not the human personality level, at another level, it is at a spiritual level, that is the curriculum that person needs to have. It is optimum for them. And it's not Pollyanna-ish. I can feel it is rooted in an absolute depth of understanding of Dharma, for me. I mean, as deep as I've been able to get. A sense of the rightness of people's life experiences, even as traumatic as they might be. And that is so deeply imbued in me now that I am able to be with somebody that's suffering, and they feel that my heart hurts because I'm a human with them, and at the same moment there is an equanimity in me, and often that rubs off, and they begin to relax a little bit because they begin to get a sense that there is another way of being with what's happening to them, in a way that doesn't have to keep them doing themselves in all the time. And it is an incredible gift to be able to offer another human being. The gift of equanimity in the presence of trauma. The gift of a faith. It's faith, really. It's not beliefs, it's faith. It's a very deep faith in the unfolding of the law of the universe. And what I do is I put myself in these situations, and I'm constantly watching that balance inside myself. I'm very aware when some new one comes along and my heart gets so engaged that I feel I'm losing my clarity. See, if you come down too much into the heart, it breaks. It breaks again and again, but I mean, it gets muddy. It gets muddy because you want so to take away their suffering, and you're busy judging God. You're saying, you really screwed up giving this person suffering. And yet if you get too far into the other place, it's so cold. It's so impersonal. It's like somebody falls down, you say, karma. I mean, it doesn't have the human heart in it. And it's that balance of the heart and that higher wisdom, that human heart and the deeper heart is really the way I'd call it. That balance is where the saving grace is. Not to deny your humanity and not to deny your divinity. And that's what you and I are here about. We are here for these 10 days to find that balance. We all know our humanity all too well. And that's why we put the focus on recognizing that part of us that isn't in the humanness, not to deny the humanity, but to bring a balance about. Because that's what you offer another person. When I look at Kelly, I see a soul that has taken an incarnation that has a curriculum. And when I look at some of you, and I know you have problems with addiction, and problems with sexual obsessions, and problems with loneliness, and problems with anger, and problems with diseases, and problems with frigidity and tightness, and I look and I see the whole sea of stuff, or you tell me about it. And I just see curriculum after curriculum after curriculum after curriculum, and I just see a group of beautiful souls on earth, each having its own karmic work to do. And at the same moment, when you present it to me, my heart hurts. You don't protect your heart from breaking. Because in a way, a broken heart is like cracking the shell to let the deeper heart come forth. Because compassion is, it's like the monk who's crying because his son has died, and the student comes up and says, "What are you crying about? You know it's all illusion." And he says, "Yes, but the death of a son is the greatest illusion." and Maharaji crying when I was hurting. That you don't close off your humanity by any means, but you balance your humanity. And if you don't balance your humanity, you burn out. And if you don't balance your humanity, you armor your heart. And if you armor your heart, you starve to death. And that's why you burn out, because you're not getting fed. Because you've got to avert your eyes from the suffering of the world. You can't look at the have-nots in the world. You can't stand it. You've got to look away all the time. You've got to avert your eyes from Central America and from India and from all those places. Because you just can't stand it. Because you feel so impotent to do something to take away the suffering. We're going to talk about healing and helping and all those things in a couple of days, so I'm not going to belabor that. I'm nearly stopping. I just want to say a couple more things. If you are going to be free, your freedom means that you do not avert your eyes from anything in yourself or in anybody else. Freedom means to be a free awareness in what is. No aversion, no attachment. They say that for a saint, all the world are their children. And you feel the suffering of another person the same way you would as if it were your child. It's almost unbearable. And what makes it bearable, there is a beautiful statue of the Buddha, and it has a little smile at the edge of its mouth, and it's called the smile of unbearable compassion. Sounds like a paradox. The smile of unbearable compassion. It's the unbearable compassion. It's beyond bearing. And if you were somebody, you couldn't bear it. But you are the universe, and that is what you are. You are all of that. And it's that balance of inside yourself. A smile of unbearable compassion. And that ability to embrace the suffering into yourself, to just keep taking it in and look towards it instead of away from it, and look towards it and then take the way in which it reacts in you and keep doing that delicate balancing number to balance that you still feel the humanity and at the same moment you allow. You don't sit around judging God like Job, like, what have you done to me? I'm a good guy. What are you doing this to me for? You don't apply your rational criteria to the universe, because the way karma works is not understandable by your rational mind, since your rational mind is a product of karma. And a system cannot understand something that is meta to itself. It's a logical impossibility. So that you don't hear the full universe. And there's where the faith comes, and the faith is deepened through your own practices, through your own direct experiences. It's not beliefs that somebody hands you, it's faith that comes through your own direct experiences. So you learn to keep your heart open in hell, finally. Recently I took a chemical, it was like a 10-minute acid trip. Somebody had this new chemical and I said I would try it, and about 20 seconds after I took it, it came. I was in a very, right at the edge of the void, and then as I came back, I began to be aware of the universe and the nature of suffering, nature of what's called dukkha, or suffering. And I experienced an involuntary process going on in myself which sounded like retching. I was going, and the people who were around me were getting buckets and all that. And it was interesting because inside of me, I was in a state of bliss, first of all. And at the same moment, what I was experiencing was I was gorging on my consuming of the suffering into myself. It was like a mother embracing its children into itself, and it was like, It was the most primordial experience. It lasted about 3 minutes. But I recognized exactly how that was an image of just what was going on in my life. That if you're going to be free, you can't avert your gaze from anything. And you can't even avert your gaze into pity, or avert your gaze into kindness, or into righteousness. They deserve to suffer. Can't avert your gaze at all. You've just got to sit with the bare facts of the phenomena of what's going on. And when you look into the eyes of somebody that has done a lot of that work, their eyes look dead, almost burned out, empty, but very, very deep and kind of timeless and just present. You watch the eyes, like Ramana Maharshi's eyes, the eyes like that. Ananda Maya's eyes. You look into those eyes and you just see that they can look at it all. They're eyes that look at the universe as it is. And they don't have to dissemble in order to keep it together. That's what freedom is. Freedom isn't all ha ha ha, it's all. And yet, it has bliss. It has a incredible quality of joy in it. And that's what was so staggering to me, that I was in bliss at the same moment this process of incorporating the suffering was going on into myself. It was the bliss of intimacy. It was the bliss of being with the beloved. It was the bliss of merging with the universe. It's the way you would take on the suffering of somebody you love if you could. In which you just become the whole organism, just all of it. It's all inside you. It's all inside you. And it's interesting when your mind starts to let go of your separateness, how when tomorrow, when you hear the statistics, like there is enough food in the world to go around and yet people are starving, you get a sense of our confusion as an organism, our confusion. That we got so frightened that the fear led to greed, and the greed led to separateness, and the separateness led to protecting the king of the mountain status, and that led to such suffering in other people, and that suffering in other people leads to terrorism and to violence, and that violence threatens the establishment more, and so the whole game goes on, and you see how what you have to do in yourself to become an instrument for the change of all that. Because physician, heal thyself. That if you would have the world peaceful, you better be peaceful. And if you would have the world non-reactive to suffering other than to relieve it where it can, you have to really be that way in yourself. So you see what the agenda is. And the agenda is incredibly profound, and it starts with you. It starts inside. It starts with your own dealing with your own suffering.